Hi, hello everyone, and welcome to another one of our IndieBio events where we discuss the fundamental questions of biotech. My name is Julie Wolf. I'm part of the IndieBio team here in our new New York program, and I'm really excited for today's topic and question and the thought experts that we brought in order to address it. But before I introduce them, let me introduce you to our virtual space in case this is your first time visiting. We have a number of different features about this platform that we're hoping to carve out our little piece of the internet and make it feel a little homier for you. Part of that is our interactive chat over here on the side. You should be able to submit your questions in there and I will be able to see them and ask our guests. So if you do have a question during today's panel, by all means, go ahead and put it into that interactive box, but you can also use that to chat amongst yourselves. Additionally, as you scroll down, you'll see that there is information about both of our guests who are here today, their LinkedIn information, their companies, and links directly to some of the articles that we will talk about, I think, during today's conversation. And you'll also notice that there are two additional buttons. One of those is a subscription to the IndieBio New York events newsletter. If you want to find out additional ways that you can be a part of the IndieBio conversation, by all means, sign up for that. And once a week, we're going to send just into your inbox ways that you can engage with us at IndieBio. Also, you'll see that there's a button for applications, and that's because we are currently recruiting for our second cohort of IndieBio here in New York. And what I'd like to point out is that that means that we have completed our first cohort, and we're very excited to introduce their progress and the companies themselves, one of whom is represented here today. And that will happen at our demo day on October 27th and October 28th. If you want to sign up for that, you can go to indiebio.co/events, or you could just sign up for our IndieBio New York events newsletter. All right, so I'd like to now introduce today's guests here to discuss the question, of course, at hand: how can biotech solve One Health problems? And so I'd like to first introduce Shannon Falconer, CEO of Because Animals. Shannon, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me here.
And I'd also like to introduce Timothy Boulay, CEO of Biofine. Timothy, thank you not only for being here today, but for staying up quite late and talking to us from Paris, France.
Oh, it's never too late to talk about One Health. So.
Excellent, excellent. And you know what, I would like to take this time to also thank Alex Hall Daniels, who every week I forget to thank at the end credits, and I would just like to put that up front. He's really running the AV here. So thank you very much, Alex. Now, what I think we would like to start the conversation talking about One Health, but before we do, I'd like to invite both of our guests to add a little bit of color and details to your bio, right? I've given your name and your position and your company, but of course, I think our audience is interested in your scientific background and your experience in biotech, as well as maybe, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 sentences about what it is that your company does, because I'm pretty sure we're going to get into the details during today's conversation. So why don't I pass the mic first over to you, Shannon?
Sure, thank you. So my training, I have a master's degree and a PhD in biochemistry. Specifically, my training's in chemical genetics. And then I went on to do a postdoc at Stanford University, where I was really focused on actually microbiome research. But it was, yeah, while I've also spent a couple of decades, I suppose, in the animal rescue community. So I would tend to spend my evenings and my weekends doing things related to fostering or various trap, neuter, release with respect to feral cats. And then during the day I would be doing science, and I didn't really ever see an opportunity to marry those two things. But certainly, I've always for a long time felt very compelled to just do good by animals. It was not until I was at Stanford and I was in this amazing place in the world where anything and everything is possible. And I guess that's really, it was at that point that to drop my scientific career and to basically apply my scientific training to take animals out of the supply chain. And it was at that point that I started Because Animals, which is a company focused on creating cultured meat specifically for pets.
Wonderful, thank you. And Timmy, would you do the same in order to get the audience to know you a little bit better and your background, as well as what BioFind does?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really excited for this presentation too. I wish I could just sort of hang out with Shannon and talk to her about what she's doing, because it sounds so hopefully we'll have time for that as well. But I'm a medical doctor and environmental scientist. I've been working at the intersection of health and environment for basically my professional academic life, going back to when I was 18. I studied conservation medicine, the interaction between molecular biology and environmental science. Did my undergraduate research at a veterinary school, went on and studied bioethics and medicine and environmental science in graduate school. And sprinkled throughout that have also been working on oceans. I grew up in California in the Bay Area. The coast was a big part of my life, body surfing and tide pooling, and just really spending a lot of time in the environment, particularly the marine environment. And so wanted to find a way to put these things together. And it's been not a direct path, meandering through the natural sciences. I took an 8-year stop off at the World Bank, where I sat in between the agriculture, environment, climate change, and health portfolio, and coordinated activities in One Health and climate change and health and oceans and health. Left that 2 years ago, moved to France to work more in marine science, marine biotechnology, really thriving community here in the marine sciences. It's where Jacques Cousteau came from. Lots of very interesting stuff happening. And so thought that I would broaden my horizons, learn some French, drink some wine, and put these things together in a different context. Ultimately with the intention of linking some of this back up with what's happening in Silicon Valley and in the United States to make these sort of exponential gains in the One Health space, but starting with marine science.
Right, excellent, which is where BioFind comes into play, right?
Exactly.
So we've been having these weekly conversations. They're really meant to be quite casual. We hope that most of our audience is enjoying this as a happy hour, having their own wine, maybe even from France or something along those lines. And I was really kind of marinating on today's topic in the sense that you both work on feeding animals in different senses. But really, when you take a step back, and I think I was a little bit influenced by a couple of things that I was reading, in various places. The reason that you work on feeding animals is because of the way that the animal diet can affect both planetary and human health. And of course, we here at IndieBio are always interested in things that will affect both planetary and human health. And so I started to think about this almost more in a interconnectivity, both from, as I mentioned, reading a couple of things that had been published in Science recently. There's also this really great article that came out in The Guardian a couple of days or weeks ago, talking about preserving, making a safety net for our ecosystems, and really kind of talking about how we can partition off different parts of the ecosystems in ways to preserve the biodiversity of life. And I just thought there's got to be a systems way to think about this, and not just how do we carve off this one area that's safe, this other area that to preserve the biodiversity that we have on our planet. And so I started to think about this in the One Health sense, which is really a little bit more in the nonprofit or public health sphere, a sense of the interconnectivity. And to my surprise, earlier today, as I was talking to Timmy, I was talking about One Health, and it turns out that he has literally authored a book about One Health. So instead of me talking about what One Health is to lay the foundation for today's conversation, Timmy, if you wouldn't mind just giving a very brief overview of what the concept of One Health is, before I ask you how your particular companies are working in spheres that can affect both of these or all of these different areas.
Absolutely. Well, I think that One Health is something that's inherently known to all of us, right? It's about interactions between the natural world and the built world of humans. Humans are an animal species, just like any other. And we're subject to the same influences and pressures as are other animals. And so it makes sense that we are affected by infectious diseases the same way that animals are. We're seeing an excellent example of that right now with this pandemic. And these sort of diseases, but also the health benefits that animals achieve from the natural environment, the ecosystem services, the provision of nutrition and water and air, even all of these things are derived from the environment. And so there's a direct link between humans, if you want to separate us from the animal kingdom, animals, and the environment. All of these things are fundamentally linked. And for whatever reason, over the past few hundred years, we've forgotten this as we've molecularized medicine, and we've sort of taken things out of the natural environment and built these amazing environments around us. We've separated ourselves from nature, and we've forgotten this. Particularly those of us in the West. There are a lot of people in the world that haven't forgotten this, and it's their day-to-day reality to engage with the environment and to engage with animals. And so for them, it's sort of an inherent understanding, as it has been for humans throughout most of history. And I think that those of us that are now separated from this, that are living in flats, that are living in apartment buildings, we just need to be reminded. And I think that's where the importance of One Health comes in, because it reminds people that all of these systems, all of these living organisms are in fact connected. And if we're interested in preserving the health of any one of these, we need to think about the others.
Absolutely, very, very well said. And I would add to that not only is infectious disease one way that you can imagine that these things might touch on each other, but you could think about contamination and the way that we can be exposed to various levels of contaminants, or those can spread through an ecosystem through various interactions that either the ecosystem or wild animals or domesticated animals have with whatever that may be. Now, I think that this allows me to segue into how some of the food systems practices, not just at the level of how we feed our cats and dogs, but how a bigger picture, how some of these food practices are tied to planetary and human health. And I'm going to turn to you, Shannon, to kind of kick off here, because I think that it's important to consider the large picture before we dive down into the details of what you're working on.
Yeah, no, definitely. So yeah, the food that we feed the meat specifically that we feed our cats and dogs, it comes from the same place that the meat that humans eat. So industrial animal agriculture is, especially at this point, is well recognized to be one of the leading drivers of environmental devastation, climate change, animal welfare issues, the development of antibiotic-resistant pathogens. Over 80% of the antibiotics manufactured in the United States are sold to animal agriculture, and 70% of those antibiotics are therapeutically relevant, meaning those same antibiotics that are used in livestock are also administered to people in hospitals who go in because they have, for example, a staph infection. It's not well documented, but especially for folks who have, say, for example, blood cancer and are going and are undergoing bone marrow transplant, their immune systems are ablated, and it is very, very common for these folks to actually die of bacterial infection rather than cancer. And so we're at a point where it's sort of considered a post-antibiotic era, where all of the antibiotics that we've discovered in the past several decades, now there are microbes that have emerged that are resistant to all of these. And so, as scientists, we've looked at what are the main reasons for this. And when we just look at the numbers and we say 80% of those are sold to animal agriculture, that speaks volumes. So although there is some discussion around, people are being overprescribed antibiotics and so on and so forth, really there's no other number that compares with what's given to, what's sold to the animal agriculture industry. So this affects human health in a huge way that is largely unrecognized. So
and just to connect the dots here, to connect the dots, what you're saying is that not only are these animals prescribed all of these antibiotics, but because that kind of selective force is out there in the world, then the resistance can develop within these animals, and those resistant microbes can then somehow be passed on to people.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's very, very common for farmed animals actually not to necessarily they're not treated with antibiotics because they actually have an infection, but they're prophylactically given these antibiotics because, for whatever reason, we've observed that that animals tend to grow fatter and bigger when they're given antibiotics at basically these subtherapeutic doses. And when I say subtherapeutic, what I mean is these are doses whereby they don't actually kill microbes. but it's not a dose that would actually kill the bacteria. And that's the real problem, which is why when you are administered an antibiotic from your doctor, they say, make sure you take the entire course, because if you stop too soon, then there are some microbes that linger, and these are the ones that actually develop resistance. So when livestock are constantly being fed or administered these antibiotics at a dose that actually doesn't kill pathogens, this is a perfect breeding ground for the development of resistance. And so then what happens is, of course, it's then excreted in manure, right? And as soon as manure gets into the water system, then I mean, that's it. So there's a rapid spread of these pathogens and of these bacteria, even commensal bacteria. So, I mean, in the gut, you could have a bacteria that is otherwise a pretty friendly host or a pretty friendly bacteria. But if it has if it harbors a gene that is allows for the development of, if it basically harbors a gene that can prevent an antibiotic from being able to kill it, it can also share that gene with other pathogenic bacteria. So this is just one element of sort of why animal agriculture presents a really big problem to humanity, to the globe. And so, of course, humans are the main consumers of animal-derived calories, but there's this other huge and hugely significant population that is our pets, in fact, yeah, a recent study has showed that more than a quarter of the environmental effects of the animal agriculture industry are directly attributable to the foods that Americans feed their cats and dogs. So because I think people tend to think about humans as being the main consumers of animal-based products, and we are, all of the focus is sort of shunted onto taking animal-based ingredients out of the human food supply chain. So creating these amazing plant-based options and eventually cultured meat for humans as well. But because there is this other significant group that just doesn't get recognized, for us, we really saw this as an opportunity to, to sort of tap this area that is largely gone overlooked. And so for us to really make a dent in this very significant piece that most people aren't looking at, and that's our pets.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that you've stated the problem of antibiotic resistance very, very cogently, but also the fact that even if we do treat the human people who are eating meat that is grown in the more conventional sense, that there will continue to be a market unless people like you come along and say, hey, we can turn this into an opportunity to both fix the planet and to feed our pets. And I think I think many of the people in our audience may have heard that antibiotic resistance is one of the reasons why the current animal and livestock raising practices is not ideal. But I think it might be a little bit of a surprise. I don't know if our audience is, maybe I'm making assumptions here. I hate when I do this, but I'm already halfway down this road. So I think to me, one of the larger surprises was learning that this is also a problem with aquaculture, and that antibiotic use in aquaculture is still a major driver of some of these resistant strains of bacteria. And so Timmy, could you talk about how this can affect the resistance within, the species in the ocean, either in aquaculture, aqua farming, or within just greater marine life?
Yeah, I'm really happy we're talking about this. Antimicrobial resistance is a massive issue, as you know, for humans and for animals. It's sort of cited as one of the biggest global health threats, sort of up there with climate change, and pandemics now as well. But it's something that's been long known and long studied in humans. And in recent years, there's been a redirected focus, as Shannon was saying, into agriculture, because a lot of these antimicrobial reservoirs sort of move over from species and infect humans as well. And so you get a horizontal gene transfer between the species that affect animals and that infect humans. And so this problem is not immune to aquaculture, or aquaculture is not immune to antibiotic resistance either. And there's various reasons for that. The oceans are a sort of absolute cesspit of bacteria and viruses. And for this reason, the marine space has developed all sorts of fascinating compounds that have helped us develop biomedicine in ways that we wouldn't if we were just looking on land. Many examples of marine drugs and therapies that have come from the ocean. And part of that is a result of this very competitive environment where everything is out to get one another. Lots of viruses and bacteria attacking bigger organisms. But with antimicrobial resistance, specifically in aquaculture, antibiotics are used as an industrial additive to the field. And in many countries, the use of antibiotics is outlawed, but in some countries it's not. And so these things are just dumped into the water, whether that be an open marine system or a closed system pond. But the result is the same, and that is that you get this kind of resistance, which then gets passed up the food chain and disseminates out into the environment and then comes back to afflict humans.
Wonderful. If we were writing a movie, I think we've set up the first third really well in terms of setting up what the problem is, right? And so I think you guys have both set up very nicely some of the problems. I mean, of course, we could probably go on and make the entire feedlength film on some of the problems that these various practices have. But I would like to transition into that middle third where we talk about what your technologies are. What are some of the technologies that are going to alleviate these? And I think both of you have entirely innovated systems that also kind of just coincidentally are both based on human health practices and have been discovered based on regenerative medicine and the way that we can use stem cells in order to cultivate some of these meat cells that will then allow us to well, I can't say it nearly as well as you can, Shannon. Why don't I pass it over and you can talk about the way that you are addressing some of these problems with your solution.
Yeah, certainly. So as we're looking at specifically pet food, so just as you say, we're using stem cells and growing these up. And so for folks in the audience who are unfamiliar with cultured meat, I'll just say just high level. So basically what we do is in a one-time scenario, we take some cells from an animal. That animal then goes on to live. But we take those cells and we then grow those cells in a nutrient mix with vitamins, minerals, specific amino acids, and we allow, basically we allow these cells to grow and eventually harvest them. These cells are, that nutritionally speaking, they would be identical to tissue from an animal genetically, in terms of nutritionally, but of course, yeah, the process to getting there is infinitely different. So for us, we actually started with mouse, mouse being the ancestral diet of the cat. So in the wild, cats eat mice, they eat small birds, and they eat insects. Bovine and poultry protein are the main ingredients in pet food, but they're also the main allergens for cats and dogs. So the first thing that a vet does when a pet parent brings their cat or dog to the vet because they have an itchy coat or they have gastrointestinal issues is to switch the protein source for their food. Sometimes that's actually to soy, but other times it could be to a more exotic animal. In any case, so for us, because we're actually making cultured meat, we have this opportunity to actually grow the protein source that is more ancestrally appropriate for our pets. So for cats, that would be mouse, and for dogs, rabbits. In doing this, ideally what we're doing is we're creating a diet that is, ideal, nutritionally speaking, for our pets. And as we're growing this meat, we don't use antibiotics. And then of course we don't use the typical growth promoting steroids that are injected into cattle. So we can grow it in a way that that eliminates, the whole process of growing up a cow, feeding that cow all of the resources that cow needs to grow in terms of the grain, the amount of water that needs to be fed, or the amount of water that's required to sustain a cow for its lifetime before it's slaughtered. We can produce that same amount of meat with a fraction of the environmental effects. So in doing that, what we are also doing, of course, is we're reducing the pressure on the supply chain, the human supply chain, and we're also targeting targeting basically the animal agriculture industry, in that we are ideally making it less viable for them to continue to sell meat at the low price point that they're selling it at. Something that a lot of people don't realize is that pet food is made from something called 4D meat. So it comes from animals that are dead, diseased, dying, and disabled. So these are these are animals that don't ever make it to slaughter. So they might have died due to dehydration or to infection. In any case, those animals can't be sold as food for humans, but there's a large percentage of those animals. And if the animal agriculture industry was unable to sell them and recoup that profit, they would actually not only lose that money, but they would have to pay to have those animals disposed of as biohazardous waste. So instead, all of those animals are sent to something called carcasses, or sent to something called a rendering facility. And in this rendering facility, it's basically mounds of carcasses. The environment is rife with bacteria, and so this meat is basically it's sterilized, high heat, high pressure. And the result is a lot of the nutrients actually that would otherwise be found in meat are lost because of this. And so the irony is that when people talk about cats being carnivores, which they are in the wild, commercial pet food is a great example of an industry that actually all of those nutrients that cats need, including taurine, for example, and those essential B vitamins, they're added back in synthetic form because they're no longer present in meat. So what we're able to do with our cultured meat is actually create a product that, is not only better for the environment for all of the reasons we discussed and for human health, but we can also create a product that's superior for our pets because it actually just innately retains those nutrients that meat otherwise would have. I'm not even sure if I answered your question, but anyhow.
No, you did. That's really wonderful. And I have a number of different ways that I want follow-up questions that I'd like to ask here. One from me, which is just as my experience working at the bench with, in vitro culture, almost all scientists who are working, let's say in an academic research facility, add antibiotics because they don't want to have any contamination of their cells. And yet it sounds like you're able to grow really large numbers of mouse cells, or perhaps rabbit cells, depending on who you're making, which animal you're making that food for, without antibiotics. And I wonder how you face that challenge of potential contamination, which could ruin an entire batch of some of these cells that you're growing.
Yeah, really careful aseptic technique is definitely the main reason. But the other, as we move forward, something that we get asked all the time by like potential investors, how big is the bioreactor you can ultimately build? Actually, for us, what we're looking at is rather than having this really, really large tank, something that we're looking at as we continue to optimize and build it, our perfect system is basically having many smaller scale units, so that if something does go wrong, you don't lose 600 liters or of culture, but it's a much smaller scale. But I think the aseptic technique part is really important. And as you say it, I guess we have for whatever reason, we seem to have done a really good job at staving off infection of our culture. We haven't really had any issues with that.
Oh, well, that's wonderful to hear. And I hope I haven't, jinxed your system by even bringing up the topic. We do have a question from the audience, and I'd like to thank people who are submitting questions. I will incorporate these. And so Stephen Kohler asks, what are the advantages of your animal-based culture system over plant-based pet food, for example, soy?
Oh, such a good question. So thanks for asking. So, as I discussed, soy is an excellent protein. It's in terms of its amino acid composition, and so in fact, a lot of pets. So there are hypoallergenic pet foods that the veterinarian would prescribe that are soy based, even for cats that are they contain no meat. Now, this is not something that the veterinarian is going to say this is a meat free diet, but it's a hypoallergenic diet. But the real issue is that people don't want to feed their pets, especially their cats, a meat free diet. That is the real issue. So the problem is, it's actually easier but it's actually easier for us just to create that cultured meat that people want than it is to convince people that we can make this nutritionally complete diet for cats that does not actually contain any animal-based ingredients. It's just not something that folks will readily accept. So that's why we're focused on cultured meat, because plant-based will just always, at least in my lifetime, our lifetime, will be niche at best. That's why.
Okay, well, that certainly makes sense, because after all, the people who are your customers are not necessarily the same as your clients, right? So the customers are the humans who are the pet parents, and you need to convince them to open up their wallets. That makes sense. One additional question about the comparison of the gases emitted from it looks like a question comparing the environmental impact of lab-grown meat, suggesting that perhaps some studies have shown that it is higher than that of livestock, and that the energy costs, I see, questioning the energy costs of running, let's say, a distributed system where you have many different bioreactors running. Can you speak a little on that, Shannon?
Yeah, a little bit. There was one study that was published, and that study was fraught with issues. So although that seemed to make a lot of headline, digging into it, the actual science of the paper, there are many aspects that just don't. The argument does not hold water. So. And ultimately, we just have to see, right? Like, nobody's making this at scale yet. So at this point, everybody's making these projections. I would say that probably the folks who are actually in the lab and doing it have a better sense of what these energetic costs are than the theoreticians. But yeah, we'll soon see.
I guess it depends on what the demand is and how that scales with the bioreactors, huh?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that it's necessarily, I mean, the demand. I think if we're just looking at it one-to-one, I mean, that's the way this is being assessed. And by and large, from many evaluations, it looks like cultured meat is definitely a much more environmentally sustainable option. But there was that one paper that seemed to ruffle everybody's feathers. But yes, scientifically, there are a lot of problems with it.
I see. All right, well, thank you for addressing that so directly. All right, now I want to turn over. I think I began this this thread by talking about how both of our founders here are using different types of technologies that were based in human medicine, and from there went into the regenerative medicine, which Shannon is using with Because Animals. But she is not the only one. There's another, the biofines, or the fines that Biofin is making, is also based on human medicine, but of course being used for aquaculture. And so can you talk a little bit, Timmy, about how some of these human medicines of nanotechnologies that have been used for perhaps even decades within different human medicines are now being applied to make fish farming a more sustainable practice?
Absolutely. And just want to say thanks to Shannon too. That was really fascinating. And you know, I think we're doing something similar in theme, at least, in that we're taking biotechnology to enhance existing natural solutions that are already in the environment. But for whatever reason, you know, we've lost our way with these human systems, and we've made something unnatural. And so we're trying to renaturalize it in a way. And so what that means for aquaculture is, well, first of all, aquaculture is a fish farming. It's a major global industry. About 50% of the fish that we now eat comes from fish farms, and that's only going to increase in the future. It's a massive market. It will be $300 billion in the next 10 years. The chances are the last piece of salmon that you had in sushi or from Whole Foods even came from a farm. That being said, there are these problems with the industry. You know, fish were not naturally meant to be raised in dense facilities, either in ponds on shore or offshore in marine systems, but penned in. And as a result, they get diseases, they get stressed out, they have a lot of problems. They're also fed things that are unnatural, that's not in their diet. Salmon are predators, right? And they like to hunt other fish and they like to eat other fish. In the farming system, they're fed all sorts of things. Some of them are fish, some of them are not. And as a result, their immune health suffers, their gut health suffers, they don't grow the way that they should. And so you end up actually inputting more fish than you get out of the system. That in combination with all the other stuff that you're mixing in with this fish food. And so it's really a problem, right? So in addition to compounding this issue of depleting fisheries globally, because you're taking fish out of the marine environment to put into fish farming, you're also taking soy and other ingredients and then putting that into the marine system as well, and causing this pollution and eutrophication. And so you're compounding the environmental challenges through something that was meant to be a solution, which is aquaculture. That being said, there's a lot of innovation happening in the space. There's a tremendous opportunity to clean this up and to do it in a way that is more sustainable and is more natural. But in order to do so, you need some technology, and this is where we come in. So our team is comprised of medical scientists. My two founders are a molecular biologist and a nanoscientist who have worked in human biomedicine, and in particular working in encapsulation science, developing delivery mechanisms for drugs and nutrients. And this is used in human biomedicine quite a bit. It's used in agriculture and in cosmetics. And effectively what you do is you encapsulate an ingredient in biodegradable polymer. And what that does is that enhances absorption and enhances bioavailability within an organism. And so what that means is that you can effectively use less of something, as much as an order of magnitude less of something, and increase the effect. And so we're simply applying this technique that's been developed in biomedicine, where there have been tens of billions of dollars and decades worth of research done, and just doing it in fish. Fish farming has only really been around for about 40 or 50 years at an industrial scale. It was just 15 years ago, fish farmers were throwing in chopped up pieces of fish and fish heads to feed their fish. And so the industry hasn't had time to sort of develop its own technology. And so we're helping that along, taking these innovations from this one space and applying it to another, to increase fish health, to increase economic returns for feed producers and to farmers, to improve the livelihoods of all of these folks that are involved in this industry, to increase and improve fish health, and then ultimately to create a better product for the consumers. We can say, look, we're jam packing these fish full of nutrients they would have ordinarily gotten in the wild anyway. But we're just doing it in a more efficient way, so it's done sustainably, and we can all reap a healthier product.
Excellently summarized, Timmy. Thank you so much. You always have so many facts and figures at the tips of your tongue there. I know that we've been talking largely around the antibiotic space, but a couple of follow-up questions for you as well. One is, will you be using this to use antibiotics themselves, or are there other products that you might, let's say, use that perhaps if they did happen to leach out of the fish food into the water, might be a little less worrisome in terms of the causing of some of these resistant infections or resistant even strains?
So we've thought about antibiotics, right? We've looked at the spectrum of ingredients that are used in aquatic animal feed. And the conclusion was that we're not going to start with antibiotics because we don't want to contribute to this problem, even if it's in a trace way, right? So say that we can reduce the amount of antibiotics that are used by tenfold. We'd still potentially be contributing to this kind of problem of resistance. And so what we were doing instead is starting with natural compounds that have an antibiotic effect but aren't themselves the drugs. So that doesn't give these bacteria an opportunity to develop resistance to something that's used as a therapy elsewhere, right? And so there are a lot of examples of natural compounds like essential oils, for example, that have an antibacterial effect. And these things can be used in ways, if they are sort of, engineered is not the right word, but if they are encapsulated in a way where you can increase their efficiency, there's a tremendous amount of benefit to be had to increase the immune response of the animals, decrease inflammation, and eliminate the need for these other kinds of additives.
All right, very interesting. And I guess I'm also a little bit curious about the polymers that you're using. You mentioned that they're biodegradable, but are these things that will, stand up to incorporation into the fish food, and do they help to target it specifically, or is it just that it's able to be incorporated into the fish food so you can use less of it because the fish will eat it?
Well, that's a secret.
Okay.
Of course, it's the polymers are biodegradable. That's right, and there's a number of different polymers that we're working with as well, and there's various reasons for that. So you've got to match the polymers to whatever it is you're encapsulating. There's reasons that have to do with hydrophobicity and hydrophilicity in charge and so on. And you've got to make sure that you can encapsulate something in such a way that it actually works, right? And so that being said, what was your question? You asked me about specific polymers. Sorry.
Yeah, well, I mean, like, so does the polymer, let's say you want to target this to the fish gut because there are potential pathogen that the gut harbors, right? Can you do that? Or is it just that the fish gets the food because gets the polymer because it's incorporated into the pellets that it's eating anyways?
Yeah, exactly. So what the polymers do is, you can reduce the amount of encapsulated compound down to a really, really tiny amount, right? To the nano scale. And what that does is that increases the ability for this compound to be absorbed. Because if a fish eats something, it gets digested in the gut, maybe partially digested. A lot of that just ends up in the fish excrement and passes right through, particularly if the fish is being fed something that's unnatural. You've got a bunch of soy or corn in there or something, right? Digestion isn't happening the way that it should. But the benefit of this encapsulation technique is that it facilitates absorption into the bloodstream so it can be delivered to the tissues where it's needed in the animal.
I see. That certainly makes sense. Great. So again, going back to my kind of movie analogy. So if we've set up the problem and now we're talking about, what you guys are currently working on, I'd like to go a little bit more into the future and into like where these spaces are going in the sense of protecting, planetary and human health, which is the theme of today's discussion. And so I guess the first thing I'd like to think about is how do we get these to be used by people who have pets and are considering what to use as their primary pet food supply? How do we get people to see that the fish farming is the sustainable choice of the future? And to me, again, a similarity between the efforts that you guys are both making to change the technologies that people are using is the education on the consumer side that's required to not only design the technology, but to help to change the system at a larger level. And so I wonder if either of you have thought about how this type of education can take place, in addition to sitting in on some of our IndieBio panels, where hopefully we're talking to a general audience out there. But do you have thoughts on how to spread the word that there are better, more sustainable practices that benefit humans, pets, domesticated livestock, et cetera, alike?
Yeah, I do, and I'm happy to speak to those. I just want to first go back to what Timmy was talking about, which is super interesting. And I just actually have a question, if that's okay. So Timmy,
oh my gosh, please.
These polymers, so do the fish actually, do they metabolize them? And I mean, are these actually digested by the fish?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Oh, that's awesome. Very cool.
Even potential for plant and cell-based meat, I think. So.
Yeah, well, this is where I was going with that. Whether or not you have sort of like, a second company that's actually sort of selling this technology to these companies, but B2B. But anyhow, very, very cool. Yeah, so I guess with respect to the consumer acceptance,
we can actually, Shannon, that's fine. You kind of jumped the gun. I did want to talk about how we can intersect different things going forward. So why don't we continue this? So there are, I think, natural ways that some of the technologies that people are working on to solve, the problem of today can also be addressed, can also be applied, to problems of tomorrow. So maybe you, I'm trying to make this as much like a panel as possible so I don't just call on people. So if either of you would like to talk about the intersection of some of these various technologies to build on one another and to, lay the foundation in one sector and then continue to grow into larger solutions.
Shannon, I think Julie has set us up on a work date. She's trying to try to facilitate this technology.
Yeah. That's right. I mean, this is why these types of meetings are so amazing, because otherwise, I mean, I wouldn't have put two and two together. So yeah, it's great when you can sort of dig into some of the details that another creative founder is doing and say, actually, this is totally applicable to what I'm doing. Sometimes it's not very obvious.
So tell us how it's applicable, Shannon, in a way that walk us through what you're thinking right now.
Yeah, so I mean, my knee-jerk reaction or thought when Timmy started talking about the biodegradable materials with scaffolding for cultured meat in particular. So for us, actually, we are not using scaffolding, which is one of the great things about pet food, is that we don't have to worry about all that three-dimensionality that humans like, right? With a steak that looks like a steak. I mean, for pets, it's a different story. So we don't have to create a meat that looks like meat, but nonetheless, all of these other companies in the space do, and so. So it's very interesting that he's using this type of material for his application, because just from my perspective, it would be a really good. It's a huge challenge in the cultured meat field in general, scaffolding and how to grow tissue at scale, especially adherent tissue that needs to actually sit on something to grow. So the way, our tissue, our muscle sits on, it attaches to bone to grow. So scaffolding's important, and finding the appropriate material that could be consumed by people makes the life of the researcher so much easier, rather than actually having to extract that tissue off of, say, whatever, a plastic polymer, and who wants to use a plastic polymer. So anyhow, that I can certainly see the overlap there.
Yeah, very interesting.
I'd also say that, one of the real benefits of having an interdisciplinary team is that you come up with these kinds of ideas, So I came into this very focused on marine science. And one of my co-founders is a molecular biologist who's worked in different dimensions of these fields. And posed the idea about thinking about cell-based meats because of the opportunity in the space, but also the applicability of our technology. And I was so focused on fish and focused on the oceans, and she's like, "Well, let's think about this," and that it enables these kinds of conversations because we've been poking around and talking to folks and beginning to identify the opportunities. So it's it's a real testament, I think, to the nature of entrepreneurialism as well. In that you start down one path and then you shift and you change around, and you're still developing solutions, but you're sort of hitting on all of these hot topics and things that you can have solutions for. So.
Certainly. And actually, Timmy, there's a question for you, again, from Stefan Kohler, asking what exactly is going to be encapsulated. So I think we were talking about some of those natural products that might substitute for antibiotics, but I believe that your first product is unrelated to disease prevention.
Yeah, we're focusing on nutrients. There's various reasons for this. One, nutrients that improve overall health, but they're also something that can be expensive. And some of the nutrients that fish are fed now are derived from marine sources. This other fish or other organisms, and there's environmental challenges with that. And then the way that these ingredients are processed. It makes it challenging for the fish to absorb those as well. So we're starting with things that you and I would eat and that are important for our diets that are also important for fish.
That certainly makes sense. Thank you. So to follow up, so I think we've talked a little bit about synergies, which is, Shannon, is like you read my mind. I think that that's a wonderful way to take the discussion, but I do think it's important to think about how to both distribute these different foods, right? So once the food is available, either as a pet food or a fish, how is this going to be distributed, especially if you're manufacturing it in many different locations? And so why don't we talk a little bit, and this is submitted from Scott Hanchar. I'm stealing this question because I think it's dissemination and distribution of food, I think, is something that a lot of people think about in this context.
Yeah, I can take a stab at that. So I think something that's really on the minds of a lot of folks who are working in the cellular agriculture space is, exactly, how is this product going to be received by consumers? And so what we know is that, for example, when this other incredible technology from a few decades back, otherwise known as GMOs, was developed in these ivory towers, and really truly like a groundbreaking technology, and then it hit the consumer, and there was so much blowback, and it's never recovered, right? So people still don't want GMOs, and that technology, although there are problems, there is also tremendous benefit in certain arenas, and the application just cannot be. It's not as broad as it should or could be in terms of its ability to provide advantages to the world. And the only reason I think is because there was just such little communication between those innovators and the actual people who would be buying it. And there was a lot of fear, naturally so. So I think that's something that's really, really important, and the cellular agriculture community has to get right, and cannot, we can't repeat that mistake. So I can only speak for Because Animals right now, but so something we take that very, very seriously. And so the way that we're approaching it is, I know a lot of companies in the space right now are really focused on their tech. Of course, like it's a big deal. It's hard, and it requires everything. But the other piece to really focus on is that we're doing is actually building out a brand, a consumer-facing brand. So we do have some products on the market already that do not include cultured meat, but they contain other cultured ingredients, like a probiotic for dogs and cats, and then a nutritional yeast-based dog cookie. So we're using these other cultured ingredients that people are already familiar with the health benefits of. And we're using those to say, let us tell you the story of cultured meat and how we're creating it and how it's similar and how it's dissimilar to these other cultured ingredients, and why it's ultimately not only going to be better for the environment, but better for your pet. In building up this early customer base too, in addition to being able to communicate with them and be transparent, we can also actually better understand exactly what it is. We send out surveys about what they're worried about, what they want, what they don't want, and really sort of be responsive so that we can develop this product in a way that is ideally specifically suited or tailored to exactly what the customers is going to want right out the gate. Because I think the worst thing that we can do is just sort of work on this quietly without actually having any sort of consumer input. So that's what we're doing, is we're building a consumer-facing brand in tandem with building a biotech company, which has its challenges, but I think ultimately it's really it's the most likely way to be successful.
Yeah, certainly. And I would imagine that on the biofin side, that it might actually benefit you to say this fish, if you buy that's been fed with biofin included omega-3s, can increase all of the different health benefits that are associated with, omega-3 fatty acids.
Yeah, and there's a real interest in that sort of thing, right? So you take my Instagram feed, right? On my Instagram feed, I've got all these salmon ads now, which I have a lot more of than I had 2 years ago. And they're comparing Norwegian salmon and Scottish salmon and wild salmon versus farmed salmon. And each is claiming to have the most nutrient-rich salmon on the market. And the reality is that, most of those nutrients really depend on what these fish are being fed, right? And so it's pretty absurd to think that, Scottish fish are absolutely better than Norwegian fish that are absolutely better than wild fish, right? And so it's hard for consumers to know what they're getting. But if you had a stamp on there that said, look, these are guaranteed to have this many omegas, these are guaranteed to have, this quantity of vitamin, then I think that's a real benefit for customers. In the same way that, people like products that have Gore-Tex. It's they know they're getting a good product. And so people they're not buying a Gore-Tex jacket, they're buying an REI jacket or a Patagonia jacket or a North Face or something, but it's got Gore-Tex in it. And that's a recognizable brand that people understand. And I certainly think that there's some benefit to doing that with fish. You can say, look, we want the best fish. It doesn't matter where it comes from, so long as it's being fed the right stuff, and we can help with that.
Excellent. So we're coming up at the top of the hour. I did want to include this question that was submitted right at the beginning, but I thought might fit better toward the end of the conversation. And this was, how do we ensure that future technologies do not lead to unforeseen harmful consequences decades down the line? And I think that this kind of harkens back to what you were saying at the beginning, Shannon, how scientists noticed that by giving these very small amounts of antibiotics, that they could grow their animals larger, right? And probably didn't think about, in fact, may not have even recognized that selecting for some of the resistance characteristics could occur so quickly within a human lifetime. And so I wonder what you guys think about potential negative consequences and how safe we are from those which we might not even yet know. It's kind of a hard question to wrap your mind around, because how do you protect yourself against the, Dick Cheney's unknown unknowns, right? But I think that it's something that a lot of scientists think about now in ways that perhaps ethically weren't considered or part of the scientific discourse decades ago.
Shall I go?
Sure.
Or you could,
Yeah.
You go, Timmy. I've always, you go.
Okay, great. Well, as you said at the beginning, I'm sitting here in Europe where the precautionary principle predominates, much more so, I think, than the United States, right? And so people approach these issues of biological engineering technology with more caution. And I think that's okay. And no matter what your risk appetite is, there's opportunity for dialogue and to figure these things out. And the benefit that we have now versus 30 years ago or 40 years ago is that there's been a lot of public discourse about the benefits and the challenges of technology. And you've got presidential commissions and you've got UN bodies sort of working on this. One of the first ocean conferences that I went to here in France when I moved here last year, the conference that was like going out the door was a conference on bioethics in food engineering, right? And so these institutions exist now, and I think that there's much more discourse that's happening. So we are prepared to take these issues head on. So I feel confident that with engagement with this space, both passive by reading some of these reports and listening to podcasts, but also through the active engagement of folks that are working in policy and ethicists and so on, and people that have gone through this before, that we can position ourselves in order to tackle these challenges head on.
Thank you. And I have been corrected in the comments here. It was not Cheney, it was Rumsfeld who said the unknown unknowns, excuse me, and mixing up my American politics history. Shannon, what are your thoughts on how, I think, Timmy, first of all, that was really excellently said, that there are all of these bodies and people thinking deeply about these problems. Shannon, do you have thoughts to add to Timmy's there?
Yeah, so I would say also that all science and innovation is quite unique, right? So I don't think there are really any broad strokes in terms of how to address that question. But I will speak just to cultured meat in particular. And the awesome thing about this technology is that we're actually not creating a new product. We're creating a new way to create an old product. And so we're creating meat that is the same as animal-based meat. So we can look at the genetics. So we can look at the actual the gene sequences in our meat versus an animal meat. We can look at the metabolites that exist in our meat that exist in animal meat, the protein sequences. So we can look at all of these things. We absolutely have a benchmark. And so, and for example, if we, and there's a long precedent for this type of food, even if we think about, for example, rennet, right? So it's an animal-derived enzyme that's used to make cheese. But over in the past decades, scientists have figured out, okay, but if we take this gene sequence and we pop it into yeast and we make a lot of this protein, then we can actually use microbial rennet. So it's not animal derived anymore, but it's the same protein. And so, but it's just the process that's actually different. But the product is the same. And I think, yeah, cultured meat is more complicated, but the underlying principle is the same, in that we already know that this product is safe. It's the process to get there.
Yes, excellent summary. All right, I'm going to ask you each to answer in, let's say, a tweet-sized summary. The question that today's conversation has been focused on, which is, how can biotech solve One Health problems? But before, I'll give you a minute to think about that while I remind our audience that this is a weekly occurrence. We're having these conversations every Thursday at the same time. If you're interested in learning more about those, by all means, sign up for our newsletter down below. And we hope to see you next week, where we will talk about where our future drugs will come from. Now, given 30 seconds or so to address the question at hand, what is the takeaway message that you hope the audience gets from today's conversation about how biotech can be part of the solution for some of these One Health problems?
Why don't you go first, Timmy?
It's a hard one to make a very short summary of, isn't it? I know it's a challenge.
That's very good. Okay, great. Well then, all right, of course, yeah, no, perfect. So, I think that we are fundamentally at a point in time where our biotechnological sophistication has never been greater. At the same time, our understanding of sustainability and environmental issues has never been greater. And there's a time to just put these together, right? And match up our understanding of sustainability with biotech, so we can be ensure that we're creating benefit for humans, for animals, and the global environment.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Shannon, did we give you enough time to think about how you'd like to send off the audience for the weekend?
Yeah, I think in many respects, it was biotech that also got us into this One Health problem. The reason why we have a One Health problem is because of not only biotech but tech. So it's created some devastating consequences, just like animal agriculture, but tech in general. But in creating these problems, we've also, I think we should be able to figure out how to reverse engineer what we've created based on all of the data that we have. So the same thing that got us into this mess can get us out.
Wonderful. Well, I'd like to thank you both again so much for sharing your time and your thoughts, your wisdom, experience with us. I promise this was not a work date. I actually just thought you guys are both working in a similar area of feeding animals for the benefit of humans and the planet. So really, really wonderful.
This was super. I'll definitely, Timmy, you can expect an email from me following, and we'll set something up.
Wonderful. So thank you, Shannon, again, for taking time today.
Thank you very much.
And thank you, Timmy. This was really great.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. Thanks, everybody, for watching. Appreciate it.
Yes.
Thank you.
All right.